Is Canada's boycott actually working? Well, the answer to that is yes, but not in the way that most people think it is. There are really three ways or three questions here that we need to answer. The first one is boycotting hurting the United States? Yes, it is, but unevenly. The evidence now suggests that Canadians genuinely changed their buying and travel habits. The Bank of Canada found that Canadians significantly shifted spending away from U.S. grocery products and travel towards Canadian alternatives. Canadian trips to the U.S. fell by roughly 25% in 2025, representing about 30 million fewer visits than the previous year across the U.S. border from Canada. Research has also shown measurable impacts on U.S. border communities that depend on the Canadian visitors. Some highly exposed local businesses experienced employment declines as Canadian tourism dried up. Certain industries have been hit particularly hard. Tourism, alcohol, border retail, some agricultural products, and auto exports. Those sectors absolutely have felt the difference. The second question that comes to mind is it changing American political policy? Well, generally speaking, no it isn't. Our boycotting does not affect how the U.S. government conducts their business. The United States has a $30 trillion plus economy. Canada is America's largest individual trading partner in many sectors, but we represent only a fraction of the total U.S. economic activity. That means Canadian boycotts create pain, but not enough pain by itself to change White House policy. American presidents rarely reverse course on another country's consumer purchasing habits. Instead, policy usually changes when U.S. voters become unhappy, American businesses lobby Washington, Congress starts feeling pressure from employers, or the stock markets react. Inflation or unemployment become political problems. Now, arguably, all of these items will affect change in U.S. policy. However, there's a lot of uncertainty right now with Donald Trump and the way he handles things, because he's definitely not cut from the same cloth as any other U.S. president in history. So make no mistake though, the Canadian boycott contributes to that pressure. It is the deciding factor. Think of it as one voice in a very large stadium. And the third question is, does continuing the boycott of U.S. products by Canadians help Canada? The actuality is a little bit more interesting on this one. I think there are short-term costs, but possibly long-term strategic benefits. So let's talk about that. For decades, Canada has relied enormously on the United States. That relationship has worked extremely well for over 70 years, until it became clear recently that political change in Washington could dramatically alter trade conditions overnight. Whether someone supports or opposes recent U.S. administrations isn't really the issue here. The lesson for Canada is that dependence creates vulnerability, and that lesson won't disappear overnight. If Canadian consumers permanently become more willing to buy Canadian food, Canadian manufactured goods, Canadian tourism, Canadian technology, and Canadian services, then Canada becomes slightly less dependent on just one customer. That diversification has value. It doesn't mean replacing the U.S. That would be impossible. The U.S. will almost certainly remain Canada's largest trading partner for decades yet to come. But reducing reliance from, say, 75% of exports to something lower over many years could make Canada more resilient. There is danger, however. Boycotts can become emotional instead of strategic. Let's think about this for a minute here. Now, suppose a Canadian business uses machinery because it objectively is the best product for them to use. Or a hospital buys American medical equipment, or a manufacturer depends on U.S. suppliers. Blindly avoiding American products, regardless of cost or quality, can make Canadian companies less competitive. In other words, a strategic boycott can strengthen Canada. A permanent ideological or emotional boycott can actually weaken Canada in the long term. If I were making a 5 to 10 year prediction, I would expect the following. Canada will continue diversifying trade toward Europe and Asia. Interprovincial trade barriers will slowly start coming down because governments have finally recognized how much internal friction actually costs and how much it actually exists today. More Canadians will intentionally buy Canadian products than before. We see this trend already. In 2026, Canadian sales are up quite significantly. Cross-border tourism down to the United States will recover in the future years, but not to the level of several years ago if political tensions remain. In other words, U.S.-Canada trade will remain enormous, but Canadians will likely be less likely to assume the relationship is permanently stable, at least not until there's a regime change. One final observation. I think the biggest effect of the boycott has been psychological rather than economic. For decades, many Canadians viewed the U.S. relationship as almost automatic. It was always there. The events of the past couple of years, though, have changed that dramatically. Regardless of anyone's politics, many Canadians now think about where they travel, what they buy, and how dependent Canada should be on any single country. Economic habits are surprisingly risky. They're sticky. Once consumers discover a Canadian product they like, they may never go back. In that sense, the latest legacy of the boycott may not be the dollar it cost American businesses, but the mindset it has changed in Canada. This trade war, this sovereignty threat, and this psychological war constantly being thrown at Canada and Canadians from the United States and President Trump is not over, though. This is going to be a long, drawn-out dispute that will take years, if not decades, to resolve. At least, don't expect any change until there is a new administration in place, and most likely one that is not Republican. So Canada, stay calm, stay resilient, and keep up resolve to buy Canadian is your first choice. That's my North of Opinion for tonight. Thank you.